Hi, I'm Jeff Franke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. Included in the challenges associated with securing an ever-expanding OT attack surface is the role played by the increasing use of mobile devices at both the enterprise and the individual level. In fact, according to a recent report from Imprivata, only 46% of manufacturing organizations have the ability to maintain control over who has access to such devices and when. And 61% are using shared PIN numbers to secure these devices. Additionally, an average of 16% of these devices are lost each year, costing companies over $5 million annually, not to mention the collateral damage from a security perspective. And this should be a huge concern, as only 47% of respondents stated their organizations secure apps, and 60% are unable to protect data and privacy by locking down devices between each use. The same percentage stated that access to mobile applications did not require manual authentication. This translates to an opportunity for hackers to unleash catastrophic damage by leveraging any vulnerabilities in areas like remote monitoring, and potentially new ways to worm into the networks associated with controlling your machines and your systems. We'll include a link to the full report in the description for today's episode, but here to discuss these findings and a little bit more is Joel Burleson-Davis. He's the Senior Vice President of Cyber Engineering at Imprivata, a leading provider of OT security and compliance solutions. Joel, thanks so much for joining us, and welcome back to Security Breach. And I thought we could kind of kick things off. I know we're going to get into some of the reports and some of the topic really of mobile technology and mobile devices and how they're impacting OT security, but you've been doing this for a little bit, so I thought maybe we could just start off with talking about some of the changes you've seen maybe in the last 5 years or so, how that relates to OT cybersecurity.
Yeah, I'll talk about a few things that have been most interesting. One is the proliferation of mobile devices in sort of OT. It's gotten so much easier to interact with technology, like OT technology, like via a tablet or a phone, instead of like rolling a cart or rolling a full truck or whatever it is, right? So the mobility dynamics of sort of that, those devices, right, mobile devices, having that sort of modality of connectivity and maintenance or whatever has been really cool, but like interesting. The other dynamic that I think that's really changed things is the rapid sort of digitization of like industries that had historically not been digitized, where they would need significant amounts of operational technology that, back in the day it was never intended to be connected. Now it's suddenly super connected, and then it's, when you build a PLC 25 years ago, the expectations that if you put that on the internet, it takes like 8 seconds to get hacked sort of thing, like that wasn't a consideration when a lot of the stuff was built, if you think about operational technology. And so that's a sort of a big deal. As we know, there's more global unrest and conflict, right, which has really amped up at least nation state actors in terms of cybersecurity. And OT is a really easy target, or can be a really easy target, particularly because during the growing pains of sort of rapid digitization, often there can be really pretty big holes. The other really interesting thing that I think has come up is the creation of sort of like malicious business, or like the professionalization of it. And it's, that's gotten really popular over the last maybe 5 years. I think of like Dark Side and stuff like that, they like say they're apolitical. They primarily were targeting sort of industrials, and then extracting ransomware, but not necessarily like nation state backed, where, often with big breaches, big operations, you think nation state acting. So sort of stemming off of the proliferation of all like these, this expanding sort of attack surface, you have this like sort of like real actual like civilian business stemming out of places with sort of professionalism, but it sucks because they're also like attacking things that are useful for general the general population, right? It's like a legitimate business, but it sucks.
No, absolutely. You bring up a couple of really interesting points just there, and we'll get to the mobile stuff. I definitely want to dive into that. But the first thing, you're talking about the professionalization of these hacker groups. What do you think about some of the term they kind of tried to hide behind this whole hacktivist persona, where they're saying this is a nation state thing. They're only going after certain individuals that they feel are wrong, whatever you want to say, don't agree with their ideologies. But the fallout goes much further than that. It's getting into, you talk about the PLCs. We had a company that was going after what they said was an Israeli-based PLC manufacturer. Well, it impacted everybody's water treatment facilities around the world. So as that sort of proliferates a little bit, is there a different way to stay attuned to some of these threat actor groups than maybe the non-traditional ways that we have in the past?
I mean, I don't know if there's a better to stay attuned to them, because I also think that the hacktivist dynamic is mostly BS, right? It's like a way to like maybe not feel so bad, but it's like not that different. It's still sort of like malicious activity. You're trying to take something down. Whether or not you think it's for a good cause or something, it's still what it is. It's sort of like cyber warfare. And, often if you think about sort of conflict, both sides think they're right? Of course they do. Like that's how that often happens. But I don't see it as particularly different or in some of these scenarios, how it's like maybe used like morally justifying their activity because they're doing it for a greater cause, like possibly, like maybe, but I think that's actually the rarity. It's, to me, when I look at it, when I see breaches that happen, even ones that profess sort of a hacktivist position, it seems mostly like a business model, right? Like unless they're like making a point, but then when they also ask for tons and tons of money back because they've ransomware like an organization, you're like, oh, now that you've gotten to the money question, we realize this isn't like a morally motivated thing. Really, you're just after cash. And then we get back to this is just a business.
Yeah, and I think that's an important conversation to have, because I think that also sometimes gives manufacturers in particular a false sense of security. They think because they're not a political player, so to speak, they're not a target. The reality is that doesn't matter.
Right. And I think history shows that, right? Like some of the things that some of the like more notable hacks, over the last, especially in the US over the last little while, like I forget where it was, but the meat processing plant shut down. It's like, okay, these people are like making steaks, right? They're like butchering animals, and like that gets hacked. You're like, of course it does, because it was an easy target. Like, did it have, could you probably have moralized that somehow? Maybe, but really it was like, oh, I found an easy target and I took it down. And I think I really shifted my perspective on that too during the pandemic, when there were a number of like attacks on hospital systems. And they were actually pretty successful, because it's like people are going to die unless you pay like ransom or whatever it is. And that, that really clues you on. It's like, oh, they're targeting the vulnerable, right? Like no matter what it is, whether you're meat processing or you're a pipeline or you're making copper wire or you're like saving lives in a hospital, if you're vulnerable, they go after you. So like no one's safe. It's like if you're vulnerable, you're a target.
No, I think somebody previously on the show said something to the tune of, if you have data and you have money, you're a target.
I think that's 100% accurate, totally.
Yeah, good stuff, Joel. The other points you made there, and I just wanted to get a little bit deeper into this, is you talked about everything's being connected to the internet now. Everybody's in a real hurry to do that for a lot of beneficial reasons. There's better data flow, being able to share information more quickly, all of that. Are we overdoing it? Does a lot of the stuff that we are connecting to the internet, does it need to be?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably, especially consumer stuff. Like, so there's an industrial dynamics around being able to get telemetry off the floor and things like that. That's all really useful, and being able to pump some of that data back to, like a big cloud service that has almost unlimited compute power to get some cool analytics about how you're, operating. But like, I think often, like internet connected refrigerators. Right, or like who do you really need? Like, I don't know if we really need that. It's like everything that gets built, no matter how small or big, sort of is internet connected. I think that's overdone, because you have to be really thoughtful. And I think often that when people are building solutions, being really thoughtful, what's the actual end goal of this? Like, what's the benefit of utility? And we did go through, and I hope we're coming off of this mountain a little bit, where the technology was so exciting that we went technology first rather than like use case first. And so there's probably a ton of stuff that's connected that shouldn't be connected. There's probably like a ton of features and things that shouldn't even exist, and they're just like attack surface now because we just wanted to play with cool new shiny toys. But I think, when you get into, you think about industries that are going to get targeted because they have data and money, like new shiny toys can be scary because it's like, I need to make sure that every feature on here I'm going to use or I can disable. If not, that's just like one more piece of my attack surface that someone could go after.
No, great point. And it's interesting because especially in the industrial sector, hopefully when people are starting to do sort of that inventory management or that asset management plan, they're looking at the connections as well to see if it really does make sense. I think we've seen some definite leaps forward in terms of limiting access. Not everybody needs to see every single dashboard, and hopefully that helps sort of further that conversation as well.
Yeah, I find it, particularly industrials, at this really interesting because they are rapidly digitizing. Quite some time ago, really before sort of before the modern sort of like consumer technology, like post-internet scenario, industrial technology was some of the coolest stuff you could do, right? And embedded programming was awesome and super neat, and you could do all sorts of really clever stuff. It took a lull for a while, but you have those same competencies, like taking the new technology we built over a little, and they're building really cool stuff, right? Like new things, right? That embedded technology expertise, highly functional, right? Optimization, engineering and all that combined with new technology I think we're starting to put out a lot of cool new stuff, almost like a leapfrog to the like 2000s and 2010s and whatever, which is neat. But of course, there's got to be a settling period for some of that as well.
No, definitely a leap before we looked type of dynamic with a lot of these connection points. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, Joel, let's circle back a little bit. One of the things that sort of fueled this conversation was the report from Imprivata talking about mobile devices, specifically in the OT side of things. There's a lot of interesting stuff. We're going to link to the report, a lot of great information out there, new things for CISOs and others to consider there. But when you were looking at mobile devices specifically in the OT environment, was there some things that kind of stood out to you, whether it's a vulnerability or anything else?
Yeah, there's a few sort of conceptual pieces that I think are really important. Mobile devices are it's a fully new sort of modality of like app delivery, and it's like a physical as well as a sort of software modality that organizations of any size need to adapt to, right? This isn't really just like a PC that's portable or something. Like the whole mobile device and what we get out of it is quite different. So I think there's an adaptation period that folks are just starting to work through, right? They're just trying to figure it out and going sort of from a desktop paradigm, or even before that, like the roll a truck to a spot and hook in with like a D-shell to something, all that stuff like that, like old school paradigm, like whatever your sort of access and interaction paradigm, like it's a new one with mobile, and people need to, I think, recognize that. Because then if you approach it the same way as you had those other modalities, you're gonna find some pain. Something's not gonna, lots of stuff won't work. You will probably lose tons and tons of gear. You will have tons and tons of data that are sort of at risk. So you have to really think about it as you're solving for a new sort of space. You're solving for a new modality. And I think that's regardless of the organization or industry you're in, but particularly if you're not also displacing a ton of desktops and you're just shifting straight to, mobile devices are your modality, then you have a big problem.
Yeah. You make a great point there. I like how you bring up the cyber-physical dynamic, because that's something I think a lot of instances it gets overlooked. Either when they started cybersecurity, everybody knows, hey, don't plug that USB in that you found out in the parking lot, okay? And that was sort of the low-hanging fruit. But then as the attack surface has expanded with all these new connections, we either forgot about some of that dynamic, or those who are sort of new and coming on board never thought about it to begin with. So I kind of like to get your perspective when you're talking to employees and talking to folks and working on that. How do you get them to remember that, hey, there's a physical element to this too? It's not just data flying around and protecting security points and endpoints. What's been your experience there?
when you're working in when your workflow and the type of work you're doing is not technology centric necessarily, right? That's not the point of what you're doing. And it's like technology is there to help you, get what your real job is done. You have to solve for that physical dynamic of how that fits cleanly into that workflow, or it gets discarded or broken. And so that's one of those bigger pieces. The other funny thing that I think we often find with mobile sort of modality is that regardless of who you are, you probably have a mobile phone. And I think the biggest problem is actually like recognizing that the one in your hand that you're doing for something, right? Maybe you're using it to, connect into an HVAC system or something like that, because now that you can do that. But that's like not your personal phone, right? Like that's not your actual iPhone. That's this iPhone that you do for work. Don't play Fruit Ninja on it. Like don't do all sorts of, like, you have to like think of it as a work tool.
Yeah.
And I think that's a little bit of a funny mind game, because it's like, this is my personal thing. It's for connection and entertainment and all sorts of stuff. And then suddenly have the same form factor that's like a work tool. And I think that sort of duality there creates just as many problems as the sort of physical dynamic of this tool doesn't look or work like a lot of my other tools.
No, that's a great point. That familiarity that we have with that device could definitely sort of, you want a different paradigm in place for the application for both of those, and you could definitely see those sort of cutting each other off.
But it is one of the reasons that it's so useful, right? You hand someone a mobile phone, says this is you do this for work, and here's your app. You don't really need that much training. It's like, oh yeah, I know how to use this. Like I know how to get through this, know how to navigate. Yeah. So there's an efficiency there, because it is, using apps on mobile devices and things like that too. Is ubiquitous. It's like a skill that we all have now in our modern world.
Yeah. Either that or our kids can definitely show us how to do it.
Of course,
I can remember the first time I brought home a tablet, and my daughter was showing me, she was in like first grade, basically giving me the tutorial on how to use it. So it's crazy.
That sounds right. I do, yeah. And someday, like when I'm older, I also, like, my kids will be like, I don't understand how this technology works, just explain it. But the modalities will be different then. Be like, oh yeah, there's no power buttons anymore. You just bite it. And I'll be like, that doesn't make sense to me, but I'm an old curmudgeon, so just do it.
Exactly. No, I'll join you on the curmudgeon train for sure. A couple of things that stood out to me, Joel, in looking at the research and really just thinking about the mobile device dynamic in respect, there's two things that really stood out. Number one, the quantity of devices that get lost or have to be replaced. That just has to keep CISOs and OT security folks up at night right now. What have you seen in terms of trying to, and you're not going to stop people from losing stuff. I understand that. That's just human nature. But in terms of the recovery, the security elements, what have you seen as best practices in trying to address that?
Yeah. So like that is, I bet I'm with you. I bet every time like a CIO or something buys a new batch of phones or mobile devices, they feel like they're just bleeding money. It's like, I've got 1 year and I lose half of these, whatever it is. So I think, going back to your inventory management, and that, like, that's a key part of security anywhere, right? And like mobile devices are no different in terms of that being a principle, but the way that you go about securing them and tracking them as assets are very different. And so that's another one of these scenarios where it's like, yes, we have to like address this as a new paradigm, a new modality of sort of end user endpoint access, and probably leverage different tools. So in the sort of work scenario, you need a tool that can track where that phone is, who has that phone, the ability to wipe it, see where it is, do all sorts of things like alert when it's like you've left the building, like alert, like you should return this device, whatever it is. And so there's a lot of like sort of use case and just like specific things about the form factor that we have to be really thoughtful of. And it's going to take new tooling. It's going to take a different tooling. And going back to, your sort of asset tracking for your desktops won't work for mobile, right? That just doesn't work. Yeah. And so you have to really think of how you're using those devices, and then find a solution that's going to help you do that. And they can you can significantly reduce your like loss in your security and your data loss if you implement a solution that actually is designed for sort of this mobility paradigm.
Yeah. And again, I'm not getting compensated based on how number of times I mentioned this report, but again, some of the stuff in there, it really blew me away in terms of the lack of visibility or accountability for a lot of these devices. And we're not talking about individual stuff. We're talking about enterprise level devices that a lot of folks, they don't know where it is, they don't know who's using it, they're not really sure even on what sort of measures are in place. It was really kind of mind blowing.
Yeah, and it creates I think it also creates I feel like a little bit of a defeatist or fatalistic feeling for a bunch of people. They're like, hey, we attempted this mobile thing. It seems cool. It seems like it has promise, but it failed. It's like we lost half of our devices. We don't know where they are. There's probably a bunch of data on them that someone will find. Then we have to go into incident response for data breach. And and then the other half, because we're so scared, like it's semi-failed or we're so scared they'll continue to fail, are like in this file cabinet over here. And we've turned them all off and just hidden them away and pretended like this doesn't exist. And like I have seen like tons and tons of different organizations just sort of fail at their mobility push. High hopes for the promise of what it could bring to their workforce in terms of ease of use and, sort of flexibility and all those things. And then, crushing failure happens and they sort of abandon the endeavor, which I don't think is a good plan. Like I think mobility for all industries, but particularly ones that are where you can't do all of your work from like a desk behind a monitor, mobility is a really big deal. And so I think we need to continue sort of get up off the ground and keep going and find ways to be successful there.
Well, it's not going anywhere. We're only going to become more reliant on this type of functionality. So in this kind of conversation, I think is so important. And so is this survey, this research that you did, because it's not about saying it's too hard, give up on it. It's more just bringing to light the things we need to get better at. And I think really over the last 2-3 years, the industrial sector has improved leaps and bounds in terms of their understanding and just escalating the dialogue of cybersecurity. It's not a plant floor thing anymore. It's not an IT thing anymore. It's the entire enterprise looking at this and trying to get better.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. Yeah.
So, I mean, that kind of brings up an interesting conversation or a point of conversation for you, I'm sure, that you've had with folks in terms of not abandoning this mobile dynamic just because it does present a lot of different challenges. Are there different things that you try to stress or bring out when you're talking to customers or specifically manufacturers and say, look, mobility might be hard, but you can't give up on it?
Yeah, the first and most important thing I think that's always useful is like establishing what you're trying to accomplish and why. And so if it is something about like workflow efficiency for something that's happening, like walk down to the floor, like, shadow that job, see what they do, right? Like connect it for the actual work, the actual workflow, and then think about when you're going to interject a new technology into that and see like, am I introducing burden and friction to this workflow that's sort of uncompensated? Like, is it more than it needs to be? Ideally, it's not. Ideally, it makes it better. But I think often if it's too top down of an initiative to deploy mobility or security or whatever it is, without like a real understanding about, sort of being able to walk the floor and understand how that's working, those often fail. But if you can envision, it's like, I know what I'm after sort of on a high level, whether it's more security or more efficiency, being able to map that directly to like, the real experience of how the work's actually done, I think can get you, in having the teams implementing it, also have that real sort of domain understanding of what they're trying to accomplish and why, gets you a long ways. Because depending on the industry, depending on the work, depending on the company, those look a lot different. So the conceptually, it's like we want to introduce mobility for, flexibility, added security, ease of use. Great. Super generic concepts. How does that translate to like actual people here working? And doing that work before you just like buying gear is really useful.
Yes, but I mean, hey, it's people using it at the end of the day, and it's just interesting in all these conversations, regardless of it's cybersecurity or Industry 4.0, we can talk about all these wonderful technologies. It still comes back to the individuals using them and feeling comfortable with them to fully take advantage of what they can do. So.
Yeah, that is like the promise of technology. It helps people do more work faster, better, easier, or does work on their behalf. But it's sort of the utility of the person, right? Like, and if it has no utility for the person that they're engaging with, they will circumvent it or destroy it. Like it's like one of the things, like a joke. It's like, oh, this phone is useless, like check it out the truck window while you're driving.
Yeah. Everybody listening who's tried to institute like a multi-factor authentication platform understands exactly what you're talking about right now.
Yes,
So they
correct.
can all sympathize. So the other thing that always comes to mind with me, Joel, when we talk about mobility in the industrial sector is remote monitoring. It's such a big part of the enterprise. It solves so many problems. It can be such a powerful tool. But now when you look into some of the ways that we are not doing a great job of securing those types of platforms, that's another area that could really keep people awake at night. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that in terms of that's an piece of endpoint security that we're not doing a great job with, and what can that lead to if people aren't doing the right things to secure those types of mobile applications or just connectivity in total?
Yeah, so like in terms of remote monitoring, so this is a little bit, some of this, there's a few different sort of frames of reference there.
Yeah.
There's one, like embedding the pieces that are collecting or like leveraging or collecting the telemetry that you need and how they send it, right? Like that's a big piece. And often I think when people are designing those, they're thinking about how do I get the right information and how do I get it out correctly? And like, how is this robust, but not necessarily like, how do I secure it?
Yeah.
So often we find in some of these, exploits, it's not like someone's a bad engineer or it's like a bad product. It's that the frame of reference for building, some of those embedded components that collect telemetry are, I'm just trying to like collect the right thing so it can be useful, when I send it back, or useful to the end user. And I think in those scenarios, we just have to make sure that, like the concept of security is in there, right, throughout the entire development lifecycle for those solutions. Because we are no longer in the scenario where I'm going to put a piece of technology, inside a plant, and unless you are physically like break through a closet or two and then physically standing there, you'll never touch it, right? So I don't have to think about, it's like I'll let someone else figure out physical security and then I'll just, build something. So the fact that there's connectivity, remote access methods, and that's normal, even in super highly regulated environments, having that security first mindset for the solution build. I do think some companies are starting to get there, that they understand they need to do that. Maybe like building these, embedded components, assuming that they're going to just be open to the internet. That would be great. It's like, let's just assume everything is exposed to the internet all the time. Are we safe? Are we okay?
Yeah.
And then there's sort of the method at which you send information out, how you validate those endpoints, how you collect that information. Is it compliant? Is it encrypted? All this other stuff. And then, for any of these pieces of like telemetry that you're capturing and you're doing remote monitoring, something goes wrong, is there an automated process? Does a human have to connect? Does a human have to walk in? And then those are, the endpoints of that monitoring. It's like, are those also secure? Because if you secure your endpoint, you secure your communication back, but when someone has to remotely connect in to that, machine or on the floor, and you haven't secured that, like that, it becomes suddenly a giant vulnerability for you. Yeah. And so like thinking again of that whole life cycle piece, because a weak point anywhere, is a gotcha.
Yeah. Well, it's just scary because we think about, especially that remote monitoring. I've got a buddy who works for a big automotive OEM, and he's got the app on his phone, where he can plug in to see what's going on, either from a supply chain perspective, different KPIs on the plant floor that influence a lot of what he needs to look at. That type of data, getting in there, either messing with it or holding it for hostage, that shuts things down for a long time.
Yeah, totally. But that's again back to the mobility, right? Like it's really useful. It's like I could be on my mobile phone and I can see how my AC is running. I can see how my chillers are running. I can see all of the stuff. It's super, super handy. It might really break down work-life balance for a lot of people, but maybe not, right? Because you don't need to be checking that at 1 a.m. just for fun. But it is really nice. It's like being able to sort of get all of that information on dashboards and leverage other technology, right? Like the almost unlimited power of public clouds to compute and do analysis and all sorts of stuff, and create, leveraging things to create visualizations that you might not have been able to do otherwise. Super handy.
Well, it allows him and I to start our fishing weekends a little bit earlier because he can stay on touch with stuff on a Friday afternoon on his phone. So we'll take that as well. Hopefully
yeah, so that's good. That's the other side of that.
Exactly.
And you often see, at least in some of these, especially more sophisticated groups, that they don't really care if it's mobile or if it's end user or whatever. They have their targets. It's like if they're targeting a particular industry, like it's dark side started like targeting industrials. It's like I have my like scope. I've got my TAM, my total addressable market, right, and then I've got my accounts that I'm going to go after, right, and then I'm going to see where they're vulnerable, right, which is why they do, one of the first things they ever do is try to get a foothold, try to do as much reconnaissance as possible, and then they can build sort of tactics and strategies from there. If you have sprawl of mobile devices, and bad practices around managing them and their data, like that's going to be, like if you're a target, that's going to be one someone goes after.
Yeah. Talking about dark side, they kind of lead me down. We'll take a little bit of a pivot here if you don't mind. One of the big things we see in the OT side is an escalation of these dwelling attacks or the living off the land type of attacks. Are you seeing a lot more of that now? And have you seen best practices in sort of trying to combat some of those problems?
Yeah, that does seem, again, this is, I think, back to the maybe financial stability of some of these hacking groups, that they can, infiltrate and then hang out for long periods of time undetected. And they sort of don't need to. They're almost like investments. It's like, hey, I can put some money down here and I can wait for a year or two for it to get really valuable and then maybe sell it or whatever. It does seem like that's becoming more and more common. And it's getting a little more sophisticated. There's like the new vulnerability, the open source, the XZ one, with a malicious backdoor put in by like a, primary contributor who probably got their account compromised. That could have just sat there for a while and without detection. Luckily it got detected. But I think there's a lot of, that's one of those many new tactics that I think is becoming prevalent, of getting footholds, getting reconnaissance, sort of protecting your hold once you've got your foothold, and then, sort of doing an analysis, is this valuable to go now or later? And so I think that's gotten more common. I think it probably will.
So, Joel, this has been fantastic. We've talked a lot about stuff that's challenging, concerning, but there's some good news out there. I know you guys in particular, Imprivata, is doing some interesting things in support of OT cybersecurity. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about the company and some of the stuff you guys are up to.
Yeah, so Imprivata is a digital identity company. We really think about sort of, protecting and helping people create secure and efficient workflows from the identity. And one of our tenets is that we go after security and efficiency both, right? It's not an either or. So security, adding in a layer of security reduces efficiency. We've got to build better. We have to build a better product. And we have a few different solutions that really are helpful for OT, especially around the workflow piece. One, we do have like shared device management system, which, talking about asset tracking and different modalities, and, for 8 hours, if one person uses his phone, then they need to hand it off, but we need to make sure data's clean, apps are right, identity, we know who's using the phone, all that stuff. That's present as long as MFA and SSO, that's as easy as possible, hands-free. I can badge tap into a thick client if I need to, so I don't have to type passwords. So it's really focused on getting as much security as possible and as much workflow efficiency as possible, sort of across the life cycle of working. And this includes like third parties. Again, if something goes wrong and someone has to connect into your systems, like ensuring that's secure, audited, all this other stuff. Really ensuring sort of that security and efficiency are going together, that we are helping make the world a little bit better of a place, safer of a place, without people going like, I can't believe there's a new policy, or you're telling me 25 character word passwords, like I quit, whatever it is. Like we're trying not to push the operational burden of security onto the workforce, and doing everything we can as like engineers to not do that.
Yeah. Well, I think, the key thing, and you mentioned it a couple of times, the operational efficiency. That's so huge, obviously, in manufacturing, maybe more so as a priority than a lot of other industries you might be working with, just because that's what's hammered into everybody's head, and getting stuff out the door as efficiently as possible. It's also a huge competitive element. So that's reassuring to hear. And I think that understanding from the cybersecurity community in particular, they become much more attuned to that and appreciating that in terms of when we're developing these tools. Those are the types of different environmental factors we need to consider for manufacturers.
Yeah, and it's a real like dynamic. It's like, hey, you're talking about MFA, which that was almost certainly painful for everybody in industrial or in sort of industrial things, but because it was like I'm immediately added a bunch of friction to workflows, and everybody's angry at me. And so figuring out ways, and like this is when cool things like adaptive auth come up, taking in more information about the user, the environment, so the behavioral patterns are really useful because you can start reducing friction. Because I do remember 6 or 8 years ago that having to push MFA basically out everywhere, and just being able to hear the groans, the groans from the entire world, basically just like, oh, like one more thing. It's also a really good example of people that went too premature, right? They pushed the burden of security onto those end users without much gain for those end users as well. And so there needs to be sort of compensated burden if they're going to take it on.
Well, and to me, it just feels, you mentioned about getting down on the plant floor and understanding what the issues are down there and how a device is being used. Same thing with a lot of these protocols. Most folks, if you talk to them and you take the time to help them understand why something is being instituted, they're going to be respondent and they'll get on board. Everybody, that's the other cool thing about manufacturing. It's a team. Everybody's responsible for how the ultimate enterprise is going to perform. Nobody wants to be the one who didn't know any better and clicked on a phishing link. Nobody's looking to do that.
Totally.
So, Joel, you're probably going to get a little bit of an internal eye roll on this one. I'll apologize for that in advance. But everybody, when we talk to them about artificial intelligence and AI and cybersecurity, they have a little bit different take on it. So I kind of like to get your perspective in terms of what you're seeing, maybe down the road in terms of, or right now, how AI is affecting things from the good side and the bad side. Yeah,
so I have a couple of thoughts on it. One is it's super fun to play around with, right? Like everybody, like especially now that the genie's out of the bottle for like LLMs, like they're fun to play around with. To me, at least from like sort of a risk and security perspective, you have to be really careful because I need to understand how data is being used. I don't want necessarily like my company sending our data into ChatGPT. That would suck. And so, but a lot of it, like I think AI is cool. Like what we're doing with LLMs, it's been around for a long time, especially like purpose-built neural networks and all that stuff. And being able to sort of continue that is awesome. And I think that at this point, like that genie's out of the bottle sort of thing, like it's going to be a part of technology now forever, right? It's just like one of those new things, like the internet, the computer, all that stuff. Like it's just like, okay, this is what we are now, or this is what we have now. And going back to the malicious actors, they also have access to tools like this, right? They've got sophisticated tooling, they have resources. And so we have to embrace, on the security side, some of the efficiencies and capabilities that AI can and should give us in order to, not get completely overwhelmed, because, malicious actors will use whatever tool they can, but they also aren't going to care about like governance and compliance and using using our data to train the model or whatever it is. They won't care about those things, but they will use those tools. So just because it's new or scary or like we don't understand it or whatever, like we still have to figure out how to adapt our current programs and embrace it, because I think particularly on the cybersecurity side, the ostrich approach of like, I don't like this, I'm gonna stick my hand in the sand, is not like that. You're just asking for pain. So I do think it's like there's a lot more to go. Like I think with the genie's out of the bottle, people are figuring out what to do. There's a lot of cute stuff out there with ChatGPT, but like not a lot of like deeply useful stuff. But that's just because I don't think we've had enough time to bake for it. But there will be. And so I think that as people think about AI and cybersecurity, I think the dynamic is figuring out how to embrace it, evaluate new tools that use it, see if they're effective. But that needs to be part of your consideration for security and compliance both, because that's just going to be part of the game, like now or soon.
couldn't agree with you more. I think it's a great tool. I think there is a way that we can use this to get. I don't know if we'll ever be ahead of the hackers because they approach things from a different perspective than us, but I think it is one of those things that's going to help us to be more aggressive in terms of identifying ways that we need to keep our enterprise and our assets more secure. I think there's a lot more positive and things to be excited about there than things to worry about.
Right. Yeah, and the other thing that's really helpful, I think, that I'm hopeful for AI is there's an enormous amount of data out there, enormous amount of monitoring. Like often, security teams are trying to find needles in haystacks. They're going through as everything comes online, there's more and more telemetry, like we're talking about. Those haystacks get bigger and bigger, and we're probably already to the point that we need robots to go through those haystacks for us, basically, more or less. Yeah. And I think that's a great use for it. So, when we talk about analyzing massive amounts of telemetry, have AI do that. And that, as long as we validate the model works, and it's high confidence levels, great. You don't have to have a team of 20 or 30 humans scouring logs, whatever it is. So, so I think there's some useful dynamics there, especially with the way that the entire world is sort of changing, right? Around telemetry, proliferation of massive amounts of data. We need a tool like, artificial intelligence to help us do that or stay on top of it.
So, Joel, you're on the Security Breach Wall of Fame for being somebody who's been on the program multiple times here. There's only been a handful of people. So we asked you this question before, a couple years ago. I'll ask it to you again now. What do you see some of the biggest trends maybe impacting cybersecurity in the next 12 to 18 months?
All right, and I won't use the softball one like AI because that would be easy. To me, that's a difficult question. I feel like there's a lot of uncertainty because of AI, because of global unrest, of where we will really find ourselves. There's a lot of activity in the market in general, the cybersecurity market, of sort of consolidating cyber tools and the different vendors sort of gobbling up other vendors, and right, so limiting the sort of cyberspace or cyber tooling allowed or that might be out there with proliferation of AI and sort of global unrest. I think it creates there's a lot of uncertainty into the future. So what will the trend be? Maybe uncertainty is the answer. That's kind of a BS answer, because if you're a cybersecurity professional, that's always the answer. There's a little bit of uncertainty somewhere.
Well, I'll bail you out there a little bit, because that just reinforces the evolution of things. Things are constantly changing and moving. We've talked about the professionalism of these hackers groups. That's how things change, and we have to constantly keep adjusting. So the uncertainty answer, I can buy that. I'm sorry to cut you off. I know you're going to go into some other detail here.
Yeah, but I think anyway, so just thinking about it, the honest answer is there's a lot that we don't know. We don't know what things will look like in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. And so the tools that we're going to need, we're going to continue to need to be able to adapt pretty quickly, right? We're going to have future positive vision about what our cybersecurity programs could and should look like, and just sort of 1 foot at a time, build towards that. And then, when things change, go, yep, I was going to step forward, now I got to step right. And you just sort of roll with it, re-envision, keep going. So maybe it's, one of the trends, the cybersecurity community will have to be relentless. Relentlessly changing, always observant, whatever it is, because there is, I think, a lot of uncertainty in the next, 12 to 18 months.
I think that's a great mantra for cybersecurity, especially in the OT side of it. Relentlessness. That's great. Last question I got here, and actually I love that you brought up tools, because that's something we get a lot of feedback on in terms of, we talk to folks in the OT side of it, and they're like, that's great. We've got all these different options out here. We've got all these different tools, and we've got budget now. So what it ends up being is almost this proliferation of tools where they've got 1, 2, or 3 of whatever they would need. So it becomes, how do we more effectively sort through all of these different options and tools that are out there now? Would you have any thought there? Obviously you're going to champion your company. We appreciate that. But from a more general perspective.
I will talk about it generally and spare everybody talking about why Imprivata is awesome. But it's, especially when things are new and you're trying to solve new problems. And sort of new teams, new budget. There's a lot of like excitement around that, and people pretty quickly go to shiny tool, shiny tool, shiny tool. They're like, oh, this looks cool, and that looks cool. And someone called me, and I saw a demo here. I think most of us have to sort of take a step back from that and like go through a proper sort of like solution engineering process. Like what am I trying to accomplish? Like what are the end goals? What are the like signs of success?
Yeah.
What are the outcomes I want that I'm going to have to be able to validate, and then move into tool selection. So it's like a outcomes-based engineering decision, because vendors and tools and all sorts of stuff they'll show you they'll hawk their wares and show you all their shiny stuff. But you need to make sure that you're actually, you have a really good idea of what you're trying to get as the outcome you'll validate that, if you get that outcome, that validates that you were successful. And sort of go through that proper sort of engineering thinking, solutions engineering thinking, and then move into the tool sets, I think can help us from doing that. I mean, I get caught up with the same thing because I'm a nerd. It's like, oh, like someone just released blah, blah, blah. It's like, I know how I have 6 of them, but now I can have 7 of them that's slightly different, and it's fun and exciting and new and novel and all that stuff. But, when we talk about it for optimizing for budgets, optimizing for like the overhead of running it, right? Running 6 tools is way worse than running one. I think we have to be really mindful and sort of do that build of what are the requirements and how am I going to validate those requirements, and then doing sort of tool selection after that has lots of clarity.
No, great advice. As you were speaking there, I was kind of thinking about going back to the fishing analogy. I don't know why that's on my brain right now, but I'll end up buying 5 or 6 of the same lure because it's a slightly different shade, but I'll always go back to the 1 or 2 that always worked. So yeah, it's sort of a human nature thing.
Yeah, exactly. Like novel things are fun and they're exciting. So it's totally understandable why that happens. But as we move into this sort of uncertain future state, I think being sort of disciplined around that process will help us in the long run, have, maintainable, scalable security programs, and optimize spend so that we can, continue to grow those.
Thanks, Joel. And for more information on Imprivata, you can check them out at imprivata.com. Thank you for joining us today. And to catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or mbtmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore in Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@IEN.com. For Joel Burleson-Davis, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.